It began as a hushed conversation behind Kensington Palace walls, one that aides tried to downplay and courtiers quickly silenced. But the look on Princess Catherine's face as she exited that private meeting said everything the palace couldn't. Something was wrong, and it involved Charlotte. What was first dismissed as a rumor soon turned into a royal firestorm, now confirmed by the very people who fought to protect it. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. For weeks, whispers had moved quietly through royal circles. Staff members who normally spoke with confidence suddenly became cautious. Long-standing routines appeared to shift without explanation. Private schedules were adjusted. Meetings were added behind closed doors. Official representatives insisted there was nothing unusual happening. Yet those closest to the palace could sense a growing tension that no carefully prepared statement could fully erase. The atmosphere had changed, and many believed the reason centered on Princess Charlotte. According to reports circulating among royal insiders, a highly private meeting was arranged involving Catherine, Prince William, Traders, and a small group of trusted medical advisors. The gathering was handled with extraordinary discretion. Even by royal standards, the level of secrecy surrounding the discussion was unusual. Those familiar with palace operations noted that information was tightly restricted, with very few people granted access to details regarding what had been discussed. The silence itself became a story. Questions multiplied, because answers were nowhere to be found. What made the situation even more alarming was Catherine's such appearance after the meeting concluded. Witnesses reportedly noticed a dramatic shift in her demeanor. Normally composed and reassuring under pressure, she appeared deeply troubled. The calm confidence that had carried her through countless public challenges seemed replaced by visible concern. While no official explanation emerged, many who observed the aftermath believed the discussion had involved a sudden development that no one had anticipated. Whatever had been shared inside that room appeared serious enough to leave a lasting emotional impact. As speculation intensified, attention turned toward William. The future king had spent years balancing the immense responsibilities of royal duty with the demands of family life. Yet insiders claimed that this particular challenge struck at the very center of both worlds. Reports suggested that later that evening, William was seen spending quiet time with Charlotte, offering comfort and reassurance. To outside observers, it may have appeared like an ordinary moment between a father and daughter, but within palace circles, it only fueled growing concern that something significant was unfolding behind the scenes. What made the situation even more unsettling was the realization that some journalists and royal commentators had reportedly sensed trouble long before the story began to surface publicly. Several media insiders would later claim that subtle warning signs had been present for weeks. Small changes, unusual scheduling decisions, unexpected absences, none of them seemed important on their own. Together, however, they formed a pattern that now looked impossible to ignore. It was as though fragments of a hidden story had been scattered in plain sight, waiting for someone to connect them. Yet while concern surrounding Charlotte continued to grow, another issue was quietly emerging from the shadows of royal history. Deep within conversations that few outsiders were permitted to hear, an old dispute connected to Queen Mary's estate was beginning to resurface. At first, the connection seemed impossible to understand. What could a modern family crisis possibly have to do with heirlooms, inheritance, and decisions made generations ago? But behind palace walls, some believed the two stories were becoming impossible to separate. The pressure surrounding Charlotte was colliding with long-buried questions about legacy, responsibility, and the future stewardship of treasured royal possessions. William now found himself standing at the center of two storms at once. On one side stood his role as a father, determined to protect his daughter during a difficult and uncertain period. On the other stood his growing responsibilities as heir to the throne, requiring him to confront sensitive matters that many would have preferred remain hidden forever. The emotional burden was immense. Every decision carried consequences. Every conversation seemed to reveal another layer of complexity. And as concern deepened inside the royal household, it became increasingly clear that the challenges ahead would test not only individual relationships, but the very principles upon which the monarchy's future rested. But the chilling truth wasn't just about Charlotte's health. It was tied to a royal legacy that had long been buried, until now. Long before today's royal tensions, Queen Mary carefully protected a collection of priceless family heirlooms. They were never meant to become symbols of power, yet decades later, those treasures would ignite one of the most explosive inheritance disputes the monarchy had seen in years. The deeper palace insiders looked into the growing controversy, the more they found themselves drawn back through generations of royal history. The questions now surrounding Queen Mary's estate were not merely about valuable objects. They were about responsibility. They were about legacy. And perhaps most importantly, they were about a promise that many believed had been quietly honored for decades, until recent events threatened to place that understanding under unprecedented strain. What had first appeared to be a private family disagreement was beginning to reveal itself as something far more significant. Queen Mary was known throughout royal history for her devotion to preserving the monarchy's Calenn's heritage. While many remembered her for her influence, her discipline, and her unwavering commitment to royal tradition, those closest to the institution often spoke about another part of her legacy. She possessed a deep belief that certain treasures belonged not to individuals, but to the crown itself. Over many years, she assembled and safeguarded an extraordinary collection of heirlooms that carried immense historical meaning. These items were connected to generations of monarchs, royal milestones, and defining chapters in Britain's history. Their value could never be measured simply through money, because their true importance rested in what they represented. That distinction would eventually become the center of today's controversy. According to long-standing royal understanding, many of these treasured possessions were viewed as part of a larger legacy, meant to survive beyond any single reign. They symbolized continuity. They connected the past to the future. They reminded each new generation that their role was not ownership, but stewardship. The heirlooms were never intended to function as personal rewards or private assets. Instead, they were seen by many as sacred pieces of royal heritage, entrusted to those willing to protect them for the generations that would follow. For decades, this arrangement appeared stable. Successive members of the royal family understood the delicate balance involved in caring for these treasured possessions. The expectation was simple. Even if it was rarely discussed publicly, the heirlooms would remain protected within the royal institution, preserved not for personal gain, but for historical continuity. Yet as the years passed and family dynamics evolved, whispers began emerging that not everyone viewed the collection through the same lens. Different interpretations of responsibility started to surface behind closed doors, creating tensions that few outsiders knew existed. Those tensions became increasingly important as Prince William grew more deeply involved in matters concerning royal preservation. Sources close to palace circles suggested that William had developed a strong interest in safeguarding historical traditions and ensuring that important royal assets remained connected to their intended purpose. As future king, he reportedly viewed legacy not as a privilege, but as an obligation. That perspective would eventually place him on a collision course with individuals whose priorities appeared very different. What began as quiet concern gradually evolved into active scrutiny. Months before the controversy reached public discussion, rumors were already circulating among senior staff members. Certain conversations reportedly became more frequent. Advisors examined old records. Questions that had once seemed settled were suddenly being revisited. Some insiders claimed concerns had been building steadily behind palace doors, growing larger with each passing week. The issue was no longer confined to historical interpretation. It was becoming a question about the monarchy's future direction and the protection of traditions that many believed should remain untouched. As these concerns intensified, the atmosphere surrounding Queen Mary's collection changed dramatically. What had once been viewed as a protected chapter of royal history was now becoming the center of growing speculation, uncertainty, and suspicion. Individuals who had never previously attracted attention found themselves drawn into private discussions. Long-standing assumptions were challenged. Relationships became strained. And with every new revelation, one uncomfortable possibility seemed harder to dismiss. Perhaps the heirlooms themselves were only part of the story. Perhaps the real battle was over influence, control, and the future shape of royal legacy itself. And as questions surrounding the collection intensified, attention slowly turned toward one person who seemed increasingly connected to the controversy. What began as a routine internal review allegedly uncovered information no one expected to find. Suddenly, private discussions became urgent meetings, and trusted relationships inside the palace began showing dangerous cracks. The questions surrounding Queen Mary's treasured heirlooms had already begun creating unease within royal circles, but few anticipated how quickly that unease would evolve into something far more serious. According to reports from palace insiders, a standard review of estate-related records was initially expected to be little more than an administrative exercise. Similar reviews had taken place before, often attracting little attention beyond a handful of advisors and legal experts. This time, however, something appeared different. The deeper officials examined historical documentation, custodianship arrangements, and estate records connected to Queen Mary's collection. The more concerns began surfacing. What was expected to provide clarity instead seemed to generate even more questions. At first, the warnings came quietly. Individuals familiar with the review reportedly raised issues behind closed doors, careful not to trigger unnecessary alarm. Yet as additional information emerged, those concerns became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Conversations that were once confined to private offices started spreading throughout senior palace departments. Advisors who rarely found themselves involved in inheritance matters suddenly became part of discussions. Long-standing assumptions regarding certain heirlooms appeared less certain than many had believed. The atmosphere shifted from routine administration to growing apprehension, and with every passing day, the sense of urgency intensified. What made the situation especially troubling was the possibility that misunderstandings surrounding Queen Mary's estate may have existed for much longer than anyone realized. Some insiders allegedly feared that critical questions had remained unresolved beneath the surface for years. If true, the issue was no longer simply about valuable possessions. It was about accountability, stewardship, and whether important safeguards had been overlooked. The implications stretched far beyond individual family members. They touched the very foundations of trust upon which royal continuity depended. As concerns mounted, reports suggest that key findings were eventually brought to Prince William's attention. Sources claim the information immediately captured his focus. Those close to the future king had long described him as deeply committed to preserving royal heritage, particularly when it involved assets viewed as part of the monarchy's enduring legacy. Yet even William reportedly understood that the situation now unfolding carried risks that extended beyond historical preservation. If the concerns proved valid, difficult conversations would become unavoidable. Relationships that had survived years of private tension could face their most serious test. Yet, within palace corridors, anxiety reportedly spread rapidly. Senior staff members, who normally operated with confidence, became noticeably cautious. Discussions grew more guarded. Sensitive meetings multiplied. Individuals responsible for managing royal affairs found themselves navigating increasingly complex questions with no clear answers. The uncertainty itself became a source of pressure. Every new detail seemed to create additional complications. Every effort to calm concerns appeared to reveal another layer of the problem. What had begun as a quiet review was transforming into a crisis that threatened to reach the questions, highest levels of the royal household. At the center of the growing controversy stood the heirlooms reserved under Queen Mary's state. These were not ordinary possessions. To many within the institution, they represented a living connection between generations of monarchs. Their significance was rooted in tradition, symbolism, and historical continuity. That was precisely why emerging questions surrounding their custodianship generated such concern. If disagreements existed regarding their intended future, the consequences could extend well beyond family disagreement. The dispute had the potential to reshape perceptions of duty, responsibility, and entitlement within the monarchy itself. As weeks passed, another troubling development began emerging. Trust among several key royal figures reportedly started to erode. Individuals who once shared common goals appeared increasingly divided by competing interpretations of obligation and authority. Conversations became tense. Assumptions were challenged. Private frustrations that had remained hidden for years allegedly began surfacing with new intensity. What made the situation particularly dangerous was that no one seemed entirely certain where the conflict would lead. Every answer uncovered during the review appeared to raise an even more troubling question. For William, the situation was becoming impossible to ignore. The information reaching him suggested that what lay ahead would require more than quiet observation. Difficult choices were approaching, and the consequences of those choices could reverberate throughout the royal family for years to come. The future king now stood at a crossroads between preserving harmony and protecting what many believed was an essential part of royal legacy. The path forward would demand courage, conviction, and perhaps confrontation. And, as the full weight of the situation finally became clear, one thing seemed certain. Events had already progressed beyond the point where they could simply be contained behind palace walls. Once William understood the full picture, there was no turning back from the decision that would follow. For years, Prince William had avoided public confrontation, but insiders say this moment was different. The future king reportedly concluded that silence would only deepen the crisis, and that action could no longer be delayed. The revelations emerging from the internal review had changed everything. What had begun as quiet concerns about Queen Mary's heirlooms was rapidly evolving into a challenge that touched the very heart of royal responsibility. By this point, the atmosphere inside royal circles was no longer defined by uncertainty alone. It was defined by expectation. Advisors waited, senior staff watched carefully, and many believed William now faced a decision that would reveal exactly what kind of future king he intended to become. For much of his public life, William had earned a reputation for caution. He understood the value of patience. He understood the dangers of unnecessary conflict. Time and again, he had chosen restraint over confrontation, preferring stability over dramatic action. Yet according to individuals familiar with the growing dispute, the information reaching his desk convinced him that this situation demanded something different. The issue was no longer simply about family relationships or private disagreements. It had become a question of continuity, stewardship, and the protection of a legacy that stretched across generations. Sources close to palace operations claimed that William began holding a series of highly confidential consultations. Legal experts were reportedly brought into discussions. Estate advisors reviewed historical arrangements. Long-forgotten records were examined with renewed urgency. Every detail mattered. Every interpretation carried consequences. Those involved allegedly understood that whatever decision emerged from these conversations would influence not only the immediate controversy, but also future, surrounding royal custodianship. At the center of these discussions was a powerful and increasingly difficult question. What was the difference between stewardship and ownership? To many observers, the distinction appeared simple. Yet within royal circles, it carried enormous significance. Ownership suggested personal control. Stewardship suggested responsibility to something larger than oneself. As advisors revisited historical understandings connected to Queen Mary's collection, that distinction became impossible to ignore. The heirlooms were not merely valuable objects. They represented a trust passed from one generation to the next. Preserving that trust, some argued, was essential to preserving the integrity of the institution itself. As the weeks progressed, reports suggest William's thinking became increasingly clear. The future king reportedly concluded that avoiding action would only allow uncertainty to grow. Every day that passed without resolution created new speculation, new tension, and new opportunities for misunderstanding. More importantly, it risked weakening public confidence in the principles that had long guided royal inheritance and preservation. What had once appeared to be a delicate family matter was now viewed by many insiders as a defining test of leadership. Yet reaching a conclusion did not make the situation easier. If anything, it made it more difficult, because the path forward would inevitably bring William into direct conflict with individuals whose views differed sharply from his own. Competing visions of royal legacy were now colliding behind palace walls. One side reportedly viewed the matter through the lens of historical duty and institutional continuity. The other, according to palace whispers, saw greater flexibility in how such traditions could evolve. The divide was becoming increasingly difficult to bridge. As these tensions deepened, attention inevitably turned toward Camilla. Her name surfaced repeatedly in discussions surrounding the controversy, fueling speculation throughout royal circles. Whether justified or not, perceptions were beginning to harden. Rumors spread, alliances shifted, private frustrations intensified. The growing uncertainty transformed ordinary conversations into strategic calculations, with each side preparing for what many believed would become an unavoidable confrontation. For William, the decision had effectively been made. The remaining challenge was determining how to act upon it. Advisors reportedly helped prepare for what would likely be one of the most sensitive discussions of his public and private life. Every word would matter. Every implication would carry weight. The stakes extended beyond heirlooms, beyond inheritance, and even beyond individual relationships. What stood before him was a battle over principle itself. As preparations quietly moved forward, those closest to the unfolding situation sensed that a decisive turning point was approaching. The months of rumors, reviews, and rising tensions had all led toward a single moment. A moment when questions would demand answers. A moment when private concerns would become impossible to avoid. And a moment when the future king would step fully into the role many believed destiny had been, preparing him for all along. When that conversation finally happened, witnesses claimed the atmosphere inside the palace changed instantly. Few expected the confrontation to become one of the most talked about private royal moments of the year. Yet according to palace whispers, William's message was clear, direct, and impossible to misunderstand. For months, tension had been building beneath the surface of royal life. Questions surrounding Queen Mary's heirlooms had evolved from quiet concerns into a matter that many insiders believed could no longer be ignored. By the time William prepared for his conversation with Camilla, the atmosphere within palace circles was already charged with uncertainty. Advisors had completed their reviews. Discussions had stretched across countless private meetings. Rumors had spread through corridors, where even the smallest shift in tone rarely escaped notice. What remained was the confrontation itself. And according to those familiar with the aftermath, it proved every bit as significant as many had feared. Reports suggest that William's position was straightforward. The future king allegedly requested the return of specific heirlooms that many believed were intended to remain under the protection of Queen Mary's estate. To some observers, the request was about preserving historical continuity. To others, it represented a dramatic assertion of authority at a particularly sensitive moment. Regardless of perspective, insiders claimed there was no ambiguity in William's message. He reportedly viewed the issue as one of stewardship, rather than personal preference. In his mind, the heirlooms represented a legacy entrusted to the monarchy itself, not assets subject to shifting interpretations. The reaction inside palace circles was immediate. Staff members who had followed the controversy from a distance reportedly found themselves stunned by the scale of what was unfolding. For weeks, many had hoped a quiet resolution might emerge through private negotiations. Instead, the dispute had now entered a far more serious phase. Senior officials suddenly faced difficult questions about precedent, responsibility, and the long-term consequences of whatever outcome might eventually emerge. Conversations that once focused on speculation now centered on reality. According to palace whispers, Camilla was caught completely off guard by the demand. While rumors regarding the heirlooms had circulated for months, few expected matters to reach such a direct and decisive point. Sources suggest the request created a wave of disbelief among those closest to the situation. What had previously existed as a debate over interpretation had become something far more personal. The emotional weight of the moment extended beyond documents, records, and estate arrangements. It touched family history itself. It forced individuals to confront competing ideas about inheritance, obligation, and belonging. That emotional dimension made the confrontation especially painful. Queen Mary's heirlooms were not simply objects connected to royal tradition. They carried stories. They represented generations of sacrifice, triumph, hardship, and continuity. For some members of the royal family, they symbolized duty. For others, they symbolized connection. As the dispute intensified, Those competing interpretations began colliding in ways that few had anticipated. Every conversation seemed to reopen old wounds. Every attempt at resolution appeared to expose deeper divisions lurking beneath the surface. Before long, the disagreement was creating visible fractures throughout palace circles. Individuals who once shared common ground reportedly found themselves choosing sides. Some quietly supported William's theory's determination to protect what they viewed as an essential part of royal heritage. Others questioned whether the situation required such a forceful approach. The divide was not always spoken aloud, but according to insiders, it was increasingly difficult to ignore. Trust, already weakened by months of uncertainty, continued to erode. As word of the confrontation spread among senior royal staff, a new challenge emerged. The fallout required careful management. Aides reportedly scrambled to contain growing speculation, while simultaneously preparing for the possibility of further developments. Every decision carried risks. Every statement required caution. Behind closed doors, efforts were made to preserve stability, even as tensions threatened to intensify. Yet many understood that the controversy had already moved beyond the point where it could simply disappear. The confrontation may have delivered a clear message, but it solved very little. Instead, it opened an entirely new chapter in the struggle over Queen Mary's legacy. What appeared to some as a decisive step toward resolution was viewed by others as the opening move in a much larger conflict. The emotions stirred by the demand continued spreading through palace circles, creating new uncertainties and raising new questions about what would happen next. And as both sides began preparing for the consequences of that pivotal conversation, it became increasingly clear that the real battle had not yet begun. But the order itself was only the beginning of a much larger battle unfolding behind closed doors. As tensions escalated, all eyes turned toward King Charles. Torn between family loyalty and institutional responsibility, he reportedly found himself facing one of the most uncomfortable dilemmas of his reign. The confrontation between William and Camilla had sent shockwaves through palace circles. But in the days that followed, attention increasingly shifted toward one man. King Charles stood at the center of a storm that seemed to grow larger with every passing hour. The disagreement over Queen Mary's Heirlooms was no longer confined to private conversations or internal reviews. It had become a deeply personal conflict involving some of the most important figures in the royal family. And according to those familiar with the situation, Charles found himself caught between two competing forces that he could neither ignore nor easily reconcile. On one side stood his role as husband. On the other stood his role as king. The distinction may have sounded simple from the outside, but insiders claimed it was anything but. Family loyalty carried enormous emotional weight. Years of shared experiences, sacrifices, and personal bonds could not simply be set aside. Yet the crown carried responsibilities of its own. As monarch, Charles was expected to place institutional stability above personal preference. That expectation had guided generations of sovereigns before him, and now it appeared to be testing him in ways few could have anticipated. Reports suggest that pressure began arriving from multiple directions at once. Advisors concerned about royal precedent reportedly emphasized the importance of protecting long-standing traditions. Others focused on the need to avoid public controversy and preserve unity within the family. Senior figures quietly offered opinions. Trusted confidants allegedly voiced concerns. Every conversation seemed to introduce a new perspective, a new warning, or a new complication. Rather than bringing clarity, the growing number of voices appeared to deepen the challenge facing the king. Compounding the difficulty was an increasingly uncomfortable question about public perception. While much of the dispute remained behind palace walls, insiders reportedly understood that stories had a way of escaping confinement. Rumors were already spreading. Speculation was growing. The possibility of wider scrutiny loomed over every discussion. Charles knew that whatever decision emerged would be examined not only by those closest to the monarchy, but also by those watching from afar. The stakes extended beyond a family disagreement. They touched the credibility of the institution itself. As Charles weighed his options, the contrast between his approach and William's reportedly became more apparent. William had reached a conclusion and appeared determined to see it through. Sources described him as focused, unwavering, and convinced that protecting Queen Mary's legacy required decisive action. Charles, however, approached the situation differently. His instinct reportedly favored caution. He understood the value of patience. He knew that actions taken during moments of tension often produced consequences that could not easily be undone. Yet every effort to slow the situation seemed to collide with the growing urgency surrounding it. That difference in perspective created an emotional strain that extended beyond the immediate controversy. Some insiders believed the disagreement reflected a broader transition occurring within the monarchy itself. William represented the future, carrying a vision shaped by his own understanding of duty and stewardship. Charles remained responsible for navigating the present, where competing obligations often demanded compromise rather than certainty. Neither position was simple. Neither path was free from risk. Meanwhile, senior members of the royal family reportedly watched events unfold with growing concern. Some feared the dispute could leave lasting scars on important relationships. Others worried about the message it might send regarding the management of royal heritage. Private conversations became increasingly serious. Long-standing assumptions were questioned. Every development seemed to reinforce the belief that the monarchy was facing a pivotal moment. At the heart of it all stood a larger issue that few could ignore. The reputation of the institution itself appeared to be hanging in the balance. Questions surrounding Queen Mary's heirlooms had evolved into questions about leadership, accountability, and the future direction of the crown. The decisions being made now could influence perceptions for years to come. What began as a dispute over treasured possessions had become a test of values, priorities, and vision. For Charles, the burden was immense. Every possible outcome carried consequences. Every effort to satisfy one side risked alienating another. Yet even as he searched for a path toward compromise, forces beyond his control continued gathering momentum. The controversy had grown too large, the emotions too powerful, and the divisions too deep. The struggle was moving forward, whether anyone wanted it to or not. And with each passing day, the possibility of a peaceful resolution seemed increasingly uncertain. While Charles struggled to find common ground, events were already moving toward a conclusion no one could stop. The moment many thought impossible reportedly arrived in complete silence. No public announcement, no grand ceremony. Yet what happened next carried enormous symbolic weight throughout royal circles. After months of tension, speculation, and private conflict, palace insiders began whispering about a development that few believed they would ever witness. The controversy surrounding Queen Mary's heirlooms had dominated conversations behind closed doors, strained relationships among senior figures, and forced difficult questions about duty, legacy, and stewardship. Yet when the long-anticipated turning point finally arrived, it did so without fanfare. There were no public declarations, no carefully staged appearances, no triumphant statements. Instead, according to reports circulating through royal circles, the heirlooms at the center of the dispute were formally returned to the protection of the estate that many believed had always been their intended home. The significance of that moment extended far beyond the objects themselves. To outsiders, the return may have appeared administrative, even routine, but within the royal household, many reportedly viewed it as something much larger. These heirlooms represented more than historical treasures. They carried the weight of generations. They embodied continuity, responsibility, and the enduring connection between the monarchy's past and its future. Their return was therefore seen by some as a reaffirmation of principles that had guided the institution for decades. According to palace whispers, the emotional reaction among insiders was immediate. For those who had spent months navigating uncertainty, the development brought a sense of relief. Advisors who had watched tensions escalate reportedly believed a dangerous chapter had finally reached its conclusion. Others viewed the moment with quiet reflection, recognizing how close the dispute had come to creating lasting divisions within the family. The resolution may not have erased every disagreement, but it appeared to restore a measure of stability that many feared had been slipping away. At the center of that outcome stood William. Throughout the controversy, reports consistently portrayed him as determined to protect what he viewed as an essential part of royal heritage. Supporters argued that his actions reflected a commitment to stewardship rather than personal ambition. Critics questioned aspects of his approach, but acknowledged the firmness of his convictions. Regardless of perspective, few denied that his role had been decisive. By remaining focused on the principle of preservation, William had reportedly helped guide the dispute toward a resolution that reinforced long-standing traditions. Yet even as relief spread through some corners of the palace, public curiosity only intensified. Rumors continued circulating. Questions remained unanswered. The secrecy surrounding the controversy ensured that speculation would flourish. Many observers wondered what conversations had taken place behind closed doors. Others questioned how close the royal family had come to a more damaging conflict. Every new report generated additional interest, drawing even greater attention to a dispute that had once seemed destined to remain private. At the same time, discussion increasingly shifted toward Camilla's future influence within royal affairs. The return of the heirlooms inevitably prompted questions about what the outcome meant for her standing. Some insiders dismissed suggestions of long-term consequences, arguing that the controversy represented a single chapter rather than a permanent shift. Others believed the dispute had altered perceptions in ways that could not easily be reversed. Whether those interpretations were accurate remained unclear, but the debate itself revealed how deeply the controversy had affected palace dynamics. What made the moment especially powerful was the contrast between where the story began and where it now stood. Months earlier, uncertainty had dominated every conversation. Trust appeared fragile. Relationships seemed strained. The future direction of Queen Mary's legacy was clouded by confusion and competing interpretations. Now, at least on the surface, a sense of order had been restored. The heirlooms had returned to estate protection. The immediate dispute appeared resolved, and many within royal circles viewed the outcome as a victory for continuity over uncertainty. Yet beneath that apparent resolution, deeper questions continued to linger. The emotions unleashed during the controversy had not simply vanished. Old tensions remained. New alliances had formed. Assumptions had been challenged. The return of the heirlooms may have settled one battle, but it also revealed fault lines that would not easily disappear. Those fault lines would continue shaping relationships, decisions, and perceptions long after the immediate crisis faded from view. But even after the heirlooms were secured, the deeper consequences of the dispute were only beginning to emerge. In the end, this story was never truly about jewels, antiques, or priceless treasures. It was about legacy, about who protects it, who inherits it, and who ultimately decides what the monarchy leaves behind. As the dust slowly settled around the controversy surrounding Queen Mary's heirlooms, a deeper realization began to emerge. The headlines, the speculation, the private disagreements, and the emotional confrontations had all revolved around something far larger than a collection of treasured possessions. At its core, this was a story about responsibility. It was a story about what happens when tradition collides with changing priorities, and when individuals are forced to decide whether they will preserve what they inherited or reshape it according to their own vision. For many observers, William's role became one of the defining elements of the entire saga. Throughout the months of uncertainty, he reportedly remained focused on a single principle: that some parts of royal history carry obligations that extend beyond any one generation. Supporters viewed his actions as evidence of leadership. They saw a future king willing to make difficult choices, even when those choices carried personal costs. Critics may have questioned aspects of the process, but few could deny that the controversy revealed a side of William that had become increasingly visible in recent years. Beneath the careful public image stood someone prepared to defend what he believed mattered most. Yet even as attention focused on William, the shadow of Queen Mary remained impossible to ignore. Decades after her lifetime, her influence continued shaping events in ways few could have imagined. The heirlooms at the center of the dispute represented more than history. They represented her belief that certain treasures belonged to the continuity of the monarchy, rather than to any individual. That belief survived generations. It endured changing circumstances, shifting priorities, and evolving family dynamics. And in many ways, the entire controversy served as a reminder that the decisions of one generation often continue influencing the next, long after those who made them are gone. The dispute also highlighted the symbolic power of stewardship. Modern conversations often focus on ownership, control, and personal rights. Yet the monarchy has always depended on a different idea: the concept that certain responsibilities are held temporarily, protected for the benefit of future generations rather than possessed outright. That principle became one of the central themes running through every chapter of this story. The heirlooms were simply the vehicle through which a much larger debate unfolded. Perhaps the most important lesson involves duty itself. Duty is rarely comfortable. It often requires sacrifice. It demands difficult decisions, uncomfortable conversations, and sometimes painful consequences. Throughout this controversy, every major figure faced choices shaped by competing loyalties. Family bonds pulled in one direction, institutional obligations pulled in another. The tension between those forces created the emotional heart of the entire story, reminding everyone that leadership is often measured not during moments of celebration, but during moments of conflict. Even so, the resolution did not erase the impact of what had happened. Relationships inside the royal family had been tested. Trust had been questioned. Assumptions that once seemed secure had been challenged. Some wounds may heal with time. Others may linger quietly beneath the surface. The return of the heirlooms provided closure to one chapter, but it could not entirely undo the emotions that surfaced along the way. Those emotions became part of the legacy of the dispute itself, and perhaps that is why certain questions remain unanswered. Did everyone involved truly agree with the outcome? Will old tensions eventually resurface in a different form? Has the controversy permanently altered how some members of the royal family view one another? Those questions continue to linger, hovering just beyond the reach of certainty. In royal history, unresolved questions often have a way of returning when least expected. Looking ahead, the monarchy faces new challenges that may prove every bit as complex. A changing world continues to place pressure on centuries-old traditions. Future generations will inherit responsibilities that demand both adaptability and respect for the past. The debates surrounding legacy, stewardship, and duty are unlikely to disappear. If anything, they may become even more important as the institution continues evolving. What this story ultimately reveals is that royal history is never truly confined to the past. It lives on through the choices made in the present. Every decision creates consequences. Every generation leaves its mark. And every struggle over legacy becomes part of a larger story that continues unfolding long after the immediate conflict ends. Because inside the royal family, heirlooms may be returned, disputes may fade, and headlines may disappear. But the battle over legacy never truly ends. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.